Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay. So thank you first and foremost for coming to this lively lunch today. Our presentation is called Choose Your Own Adventure, a thrilling, and we are not being hyperbolic, this really is a thrilling journey of collaborative collection assessment. As you may glean from the title, we decided that the best way to sort of walk through our very thrilling journey was to use the model that was offered by those old children's books. Do you know those Choose Your Own Adventure books? That allowed you to read sort of a basic plot line and then choose your varying conclusions or endpoints. So we hope that this will serve as a good model for us. So sort of sticking with that theme, I'd like to introduce our cast of characters, which is actually just our research team. My name is Caroline Mulia, and I am in the collections department at the University of Southern California, which is located in Los Angeles. Maybe I'll just kind of quickly go down the row. So over here we have Jeremy Witt, who's a scholarly resources librarian at Pepperdine University, and you'll hear from all of us during this presentation. Beside him is Madeline Dickerson, who's at Claremont Colleges Library, and she's an information resources coordinator. And then rounding us out at the end, we've got Jamie Hazlitt from Loyola Marymount University, who is a librarian of collection development and evaluation. So, excuse me. So now that you sort of know us, and you'll get to know us a little bit more, we thought we'd start it off with sort of a prologue and figure out a little bit while you're here today. So from a show of hands, and by the way, we're going to be taking a bunch of these informal polls throughout our session, so get used to sort of raising your hand for different things. Are you here to watch us crash and burn? Maybe the whole idea of collection, multi-institutional collection assessment seems like a terrible idea. Maybe your lunch plans were canceled and you're like, I don't really want to eat alone. If so, we completely understand. You should enjoy your lunch hour. Maybe hang out with us after. Maybe you are interested in the idea of multi-institutional assessment, but you haven't yet tried it yourself. So maybe you're here to learn about entry points or starting points into a bigger project, or maybe it's the assessment part that's of interest. Maybe you are halfway through this assessment project and you thought, okay, what are different ways to evaluate how we're doing? Welcome, if that's you. Oh, we got a hand, excellent. And then finally, our third option, is I have experience with multi-institutional assessment and can't wait to share with everyone in the room during the discussion session. Is that anyone? Yes, we've got Maria, one person. So thank you so much for coming, Maria, and then those of you who haven't yet raised your hand. A lot of what we learned along the way from talking to was really about talking to other people, as you'll see, and also through a lot of trial and error. So we'll have ample time at the end for sharing and asking questions, so please don't be shy. Okay, so we are going to tell you a story, and we want you to follow along. We made some good decisions, and we made some not so great decisions. We won't call them bad decisions, we'll just say not as great decisions. As you listen, we hope that you'll consider what you would have done differently, maybe what questions you have or would have had in that point in the process. Be ready to help us at the end with your own adventure, of course. So our research project, we all work at libraries that are members of the SCELC Consortium. So that's the statewide California Electronic Librarians Consortium, right? And through that, we developed a research project, and our research project really compared print and ebook format across all of these 4 Southern California institutions. And what we were really looking at was in that print and e-format, we focused on the art and architecture subject area. So we wanted to learn a lot of research questions, which we'll get into, but that was really our starting point. Our actual starting point, however, was here. So these are not the exact cocktails that we drank, but we did start this project 2 years ago here at a Charleston happy hour. Each of us were relatively new to our positions, and we all had relatively similar jobs. We thought, hey, let's embark on a research project. And we had, some poking and prodding from our supervisors and from the head of SCELC to say, you should just work together, figure something out, try something. And we thought, okay, we don't know a whole lot, but maybe we could learn something together. And that's kind of what we did. So after Charleston, we came to our first juncture, and so Jamie is going to tell you what we did.
All right, so as with any Choose Your Own Adventure book, you've got one page to go to. In this case, page 75 will take you to, let's do this thing. We are ready to go. We'll learn as we go along. Page 21 is maybe for the more sensible people in the room. Not so fast. What are we getting ourselves into? Have we done this before? And don't we have other work to do? Should we proceed with caution, if at all? How many of you would be page 75 people? All right, we've got our page 75. How about page 21? How many? All right. Okay, so you can probably guess what we did, because if we didn't, we wouldn't really be standing here today. So we decided to do this thing. Why are we doing this thing? The decision to proceed without kind of taking some baby steps along the way wasn't only influenced by the project's genesis over the table of cocktails. We were motivated by a number of things. First and foremost, this was a really awesome opportunity for us to learn from each other. We have incredibly supportive supervisors from our home institutions, and I'm not just saying that because a few of them are in the room today. They really encouraged us, as Caroline said, to put our heads together for this a collaborative project without any preconceived notions of what that outcome might be. We also viewed this as an opportunity to simultaneously learn more about our individual collections while learning from each other. We had the opportunity to collect and examine data to support ongoing conversations about print versus ebook decisions that are taking place in our respective libraries. And then through SCELC. SCELC supports librarians in their member libraries with research grants, and they were very encouraging of the idea of 4 SCELC libraries working together to try and figure out if we could learn anything that might actually benefit the consortium as well. We all live relatively close to each other. Maybe by Southern California standards, it's 40 miles and about 2 hours between some of our institutions. So we had the opportunity to work both face-to-face and remotely. And then finally, when we started discussing, Caroline alluded to this, one of the topics that we found most interesting while we were discussing over cocktails in Charleston was this question that was, in 2014, Michael Living Clark did a white paper with ProQuest on kind of international ebook usage through EBL and eBrary. And one of the things that those of us who had read the paper found kind of most surprising about that was an unexpectedly high percentage of use in the art and architecture subject areas for ebooks. That kind of challenged some of the assumptions that we had had about our own collections, and so we decided to hone in on that. So we have, next step was to come up with a number of research questions. So first was what I just mentioned, this, is there a relationship between ebook usage in art and architecture and that in the print collection in the call number range, and what does that relationship look like? We were curious about whether or not usage could reveal anything about preference for format in the subject areas. We were interested in whether or not there was a change in usage patterns over a 5-year period. We also wanted to explore whether or not the access model or the DRM of the ebooks affected usage. We were also interested in looking at publisher. And our final question was whether or not we could use our aggregate data and findings to generalize any trends in ebook usage versus print in these subject areas, or if there was going to be too much variability in our institutions to be able to make generalizations. So we've decided we're doing this. We've got a really long list of ambitious research questions, and we needed to put together our data collection parameters. So we identified all of these variables that we were going to be tasked with going and pulling from our individual ILSs and ebook vendors. So the call number range, E in print, circulation and usage data, title, imprint, pub year, you can read. So. We also needed to identify what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about usage. So we spent a fair amount of time discussing this and came to decide that for print we were looking at circulation, checkouts, renewals, and soft or in-house usage. We did grapple a little bit with how or if we could account for interlibrary loan usage versus home institution usage, and decided that we were just going to a use was a use, whether it was a book that went out of our home institutions or came in. And then for our ebooks, we focused on reports where we could, on materials where we could get counter BR2 usage and section requests. So we got into a groove pretty quickly through making these research question decisions and the data parameters. And Although we had a focused commitment to develop the research questions, we also adapted a kind of we'll figure it out as we go along mentality, which we alluded to at the beginning, for some other aspects of the project. Particularly these 4 considerations. You'll hear a little bit more about how we could have addressed these, but in many ways our collective flexibility was an asset, especially when it did come to communication, but in others we didn't quite. We learned some things. How about that? So we're at another crossroads now, and we think we've got our parameters sorted out, and we have a collective understanding of what it is we all need to run back home and retrieve from our individual ILSs. So we've got 2 choices now. On page 32, we are farther along than we were when we decided to undertake the project, but we should really run a proof of concept study with a sample set of data from each institution to kind of make sure we know what we're doing. Or page 107, where these parameters make sense, and we are totally ready to run these reports and dump them into a giant Google spreadsheet. Who goes with page 32? And how about page 107? Whoops. All right, so turning the story over to Jeremy, who's going to live to tell the tale of where he ended up.
Yes, for those of us who chose page 107, unfortunately we ended up in the dreaded fire swamp, which is a dangerous place to be. So brave souls, thanks for sticking with us as we make our way through there. So basically we created a shared Google sheet, and each of us began depositing all of our data into the sheet by institution. And in terms of data collection, this is really where we started to run into some issues that pulled us under like quicksand, which is why we deem this portion of the presentation the fire swamp. And like I said, it can be quite scary in there. Specifically, sort of this section of our talk aims both to share advice regarding general data collection processes in a shared collaborative collection project, as well as general questions and issues we encountered that are important to think about when doing such a project. First, we needed to identify our data sources for the project, which we had done by the time we'd started putting the data into the spreadsheet. We knew since we were looking at print usage, we were going to need to pull some data out of our ILSs in order to gather local circulation data. No problem, right? ILS, no problem. Yeah, we'll see about that. We discussed the exact aspects of print circulation we're going to collect, including total circulation count, whether we were going to just include total checkouts or the data book was used, those types of parameters. We also had to establish uniform usage parameters for each vendor and decide which usage reports to use. So for ebooks, we used counter reports where available, but sometimes we had to extract data from non-counter reports, such as eBook Central's title or usage report, because they have richer data than just a counter report. And so this is where we ran into issues regarding crosswalking and remapping data, which was challenging and time-intensive for us, to say the least. In order to get the data we needed for our data deposit and all the data collection parameters that we had established, we found ourselves needing to translate BR2 counter reports to non-counter reports using our old friend VLOOKUP in Excel. Comes in handy. BR1 and BR2 counter reports have ISBN and ISSN and publisher and usage information, but no publication date or call numbers. And so we really needed that to fulfill the parameters of our study. In addition to the usage for ebooks, we used ILS circulation data for print books, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But right away, you can sort of see a concern here, right? We're all using different proprietary ILSs that output their own unique reports with their own data fields, nuances, and quirks. And sort of individually, we may know each of these quirks on our own, but when you're working in a shared collaborative environment, identifying each of those nuances becomes much more of a task. So in addition to thinking about whether all the data sets can be combined, we also thought about standardization among data source. What I mean by this is, like, even with counter data, we found a lack of uniformity in the types of counter reports offered by the vendors of ebooks that we were looking at. So while some vendors provide VR2 reports, others just provided VR1. And so we had to figure out, what are we going to do there to make sure our data harmonizes? And we ended up just going with the VR2 reports. So it's not enough to just say, oh, we're just going to use counter reports. It's like which ones for which vendors. And that was a very important thing to communicate among each of us. We also found discrepancies in use of vendor reports, even among the same vendor. For instance, Madeline retrieved a vendor report of usage, and that had different numbers than the report that a vendor representative generated for her. So while this may be a one-off situation, it sort of shows the challenges that you're working with in terms of data. And it's, when you're looking at usage, that's really crucial in a collaborative project such as this one. We also found that we lack comprehensive data, especially when we wanted to calculate turnover rate. So this is a big issue on ebooks because titles are shuffling in and out all the time. And if we're going to calculate the turnover rate for an ebook collection, it's nearly impossible to determine title availability at a certain time. So to go back in time at 2011 to see which titles were in a subscription collection became a big challenge for us. And raised broader questions of accessibility to data and accuracy of data. One of the things we discussed during the data collection phase was that given that we rely on external factors, mostly data generated by vendors, a lot of this was just beyond our control. And so, we just sort of had to roll with it during our project. The next discussion we held regarding combining print circulation data, in-house data collection practices, was sort of their effect on circulation reports. These challenges weren't entirely anticipated by us, because in large part we weren't fully aware of the individual circulation policies at each of our institutions. Are we keeping track of things that are just being browsed or only being used in-house? In some cases, this isn't even a question of ILS data, but it's just sort of a local custom of each of our libraries. And so we found it was really important to communicate these customs and practices among each other, so we knew what we could and couldn't tell from the data. A second ago, I talked about struggles with our ILSs because we're using 3 different ones. And so after identifying data sources to collect, figuring out how to crosswalk, combine, and maybe standardize our data where we could, and looking at the nuances of each of our libraries, the other major obstacle worth discussing before we escape out of this fire swamp is the fact that 4 of the 4 institutions represented here, 3 of us had different ILSs. The 3 ILSs used in this project were OCLC World Chair Management System, WMS, used by the Claremont Colleges Library in Pepperdine. Innovative Sierra, used by Loyola Marymount University. And Circe Dynex Symphony, used at the University of Southern California. In our data collection spreadsheet, we were looking to answer the question, was a title used within the last 5 years? And this proved to be especially difficult to answer. To illustrate this, let's just look at some of the challenges that each of us faced in answering this question. So at Pepperdine, we check out a book to an in-process patron when receiving new books. So even titles with 1 circulation, that's not really accurate data that you can use. I think USC had no problems answering this question. And they were the only one because they take an annual print snapshot, so they were able to accurately report usage over the last 5 years. LMU circulation was cumulative, with the exception of a 1-year period. So LMU needed to limit books in the sample based on publication dates, so only including certain dates that were published within a certain period to accurately tell the usage of a title. And Claremont had recently migrated from Millennium, but the use of materials data, that didn't properly migrate, I believe. So only data in the aggregate form was available for usage in the Millennium reports. So out of 4 of us, 3 had issues answering this question accurately. And this shows that accessing historical data was spotty for most of us. There were substantial changes in the ILS landscape within just the past 5, 6, 7 years. A lot of services moving to the cloud and a lot of migrations. And so this was an issue that many of us faced to differing degrees, depending on the date we migrated to our current ILS. But it wasn't overall a deal breaker for us at this point because we were pretty much well invested in the project. And we didn't realize a lot of these issues until pretty late in the game. So there are also a number of institutional considerations. SCELC is definitely a uniting factor for us, the statewide California Electronic Library Consortium. It's our glue in many ways. That's what brought us together. We're all SCELC members. We're all private academic libraries in Southern California. But some of us are more similar to others than others are. All of this had an effect on our research because each of our universities differed in some way in terms of art and architecture collections or programs served, demographics and usage. So the Claremont Colleges, they have a very unique organization of having a single library serve the 7 colleges of Claremont. USC is far and away the largest of us. If you add up the FTEs of the remaining 3 of us, it might reach the FTE of USC undergrad. They're an R1 doctoral university, highest research activity, and they also have a graduate program, which sort of set them apart. Pepperdine and LMU have a similar size, similar focus and mission. We have religious affiliations, and we're not far from the ocean. Claremont and LMU, meanwhile, have similar collections, sizes, and budgets. And then there's the fact, talking about ILSs, Pepperdine and Claremont, we have the same ILS, OCLC, the WMS. So each of our universities have distinct qualities in common, but not all of us share the same commonalities, though we did find we had many of the same resources that we subscribe to. On that note, resources, a challenge for us during this project was that our project looked at use of collections we had in common, but we didn't look at specific titles. So I think, an interesting insight here could have been to focus on the overlap in collections or titles that we shared at our at our 4 institutions. So having considered these challenges, most relating to technical limitations and data issues, the final struggle I wanted to mention was the one of mental bandwidth. So how do you avoid burnout from the research process, especially on like a mind-melting, brain-burning collaboration effort such as this one? For us, we really treated it as a partnership, an exercise in learning. Using our expertise to embrace creativity, experimentation, with a focus on learning as we went. We really had no set expectations for where this was going to go when we set out on this collaborative project. Also, many of us are free from the tenure process, so we don't have those sorts of deadlines to meet. And while this doesn't mean we have all the free time in the world, we have the support and encouragement from our colleagues to pursue this endeavor. And I think this mindset and attitude was really key in undertaking this project and keeping it going. I mean, in addition to all of us really working well together, we knew we could learn a lot from each other. On a previous slide, I talked about it seemed like we were quite different from one another. But that really turned out to be an opportunity to learn from each other's practices and libraries and draw on the expertise of one another. So we found our way out of the fire swamp. We've talked about data considerations, our struggles. The next question, of course, is, should we carry on with the project? We're a little worse for wear at this point. And the question becomes, do we keep going? What can we do with the data we have? So I'm going to turn it over to Madeline at this point for our next decision point.
All right, so we have some kind of crazy data, thank you, that was very challenging to assimilate and process and get it all together so that we could actually learn something from it. So how many of you, I'd be very curious, would either press on, let's merge all this data, or wow, it's time to abandon all hope? So how many would sort of be done now, would abandon all hope? And how many would be like, yes, we will do this. Awesome. We are in the right room with everybody. This is great. So we are nothing if not consistent, and emboldened by a sense of experimentation and creativity, we decided to go forth, merge all this data, assimilate everything, the Borg that we are. So we had spent quite a bit of time with our own data, with each other's data. We felt pretty comfortable that we could experiment and do something productive and learn something related to, hopefully, our original research questions. So we've already seen our original research questions. You probably noticed that there are a lot of them, and they're very ambitious. We were certainly ambitious. And just like you always do in research, you look at what data you actually have, and then you decide what research questions to ask retrospectively. So that's pretty sure that's like the official process. It's written down, probably. So we were really only able to answer some of these questions in certain ways based on the data that we had. And we knew that we were essentially comparing apples to oranges when we were comparing ebooks and print books. And we knew that not only were we comparing apples and oranges, but we were comparing even weirder fruit than that. And so our original project, when we presented last year at Charleston, we called it Comparing Dragon Fruit to Raisins, because those were the weirdest fruits we could think of together for the most part. But they were pretty much as dissimilar fruits as you can imagine. We knew that there were some questions we couldn't answer, but there were a few that did emerge as particularly relevant and meaningful. Especially the sort of broad question at the beginning, what is the relationship between ebook usage in art and architecture, in print, and E in the same call number ranges? And we weren't able to identify a specific relationship, but sort of highlight any relationship to sort of learn about how the usage looked in each of the formats and how it was different. One of the things that was particularly consistent was publisher, so we were able to identify publishers that had data that we could actually compare across format, so we focused on publisher. And then we were still hoping to be able to understand whether or not we could generalize trends because of the amount of data we were able to pool together, and then use our own snippets of data for understanding our own institutions. So that is where we were really hoping to go. A question that was really important to us at the outset was, have usage data patterns changed, or has the usage changed over the past 5 years in art and architecture? And that really wasn't feasible for us to answer because of the limitations of our various systems. In many cases, we would have had to start collecting data 5 years ago to start a snapshot. And actually, this has really inspired me in my own work. When I'm doing data collection on ebooks, I have now collecting what ebooks do we own in a particular year, so that if I ever decide in the future to go back and ask a question like that, I'll actually have something to do that with. So I learned something very concrete from that experience. We weren't able to understand preference of users with the data we had. This would have required qualitative in addition to quantitative data, and the quantitative data didn't tell us enough about preference. And we also, along the same lines, decided to drop any questions about the impact of technology or DRM on usage, because we just really, with the data that we had, weren't able to draw any concrete conclusions. All right, so we presented a poster, which means we came up with something to say between asking our research questions. What was nice about doing a poster was we sort of had to think very concretely about what we could actually communicate reasonably to a population of knowledgeable people at Charleston. So this helped us focus on what was most important. This, knowing that we were going to do a poster, really helped us identify what were the most reasonable research questions to answer. And there's really nothing like standing up in front of a bunch of your peers to make you reflect on the process and make sure that you're doing your best work. So this is our poster. It is not big enough to actually see any of the details, and the goal is not really to focus too much on the actual details, but I did want to tell you a little bit about it. So it was called Drawing Comparisons, and we were analyzing art and architecture, print and ebook usage. We broke it down into 6 sections. We made sure to talk about our institutional demographics and general collections, which provided really necessary context for understanding what we were looking at. We put some of our refined research questions. The poster focused on comparing print and electronic usage data with LC classes and subclasses by format, and then looking at the publisher. That's really what we focused on for the poster. We did a really brief summary of our methodology. We included the prettiest charts and graphs that we could come up with to communicate our results. And then we had some conclusions and research questions. One of the things that I'll talk about just really briefly that we did that was a little bit different so that we could compare our dragon fruit and our raisins was to do a comparison of print and electronic usage by percentage of usage by subclass in LC. So it's kind of hard to describe, but we used a comparison of ratios by LC class and subclass rather than comparing raw usage. So you really can't compare like 1,000 ebook uses to one print checkout. They're not really the same thing. But we wanted to know what percentage of like ND was used of all the usage in print, what percentage of ND was used in print, and of all the usage in E, what percentage of usage was in ND for E, and then we could compare those ratios to get a sense of was there a particular subclass preference by format. And so it was our way of getting around the direct or the incompatibility of the usage metrics. So we had a really successful poster presentation, and we got a lot. We had a lot of really wonderful conversations with people. We learned a lot from being able to talk about it, and then we ended up speaking with the editors of collection management, who were really interested in having us write up a research article for collection management. And we thought, wow, this is awesome. So we were feeling pretty great after the poster session. And we all came home to LA and thought, like, should we do this thing? We were full of conference food and excited about the prospect of taking our research to the next level. So I'm guessing that you can guess what we decided to do. Whether or not we wanted to do this research article. So it was either back to the Google Docs or like, whoa, 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 maybe we're not ready for this yet. So I'm not even going to poll, I don't think. We were like, yes, Google Docs, let's go. Let's write this thing. We're going to submit it to collection management. We were all pretty excited. So it didn't go so well, is all I'll say about that. So we submitted, we went through the peer review process, which I was in a session in this room a little bit earlier, and that process of submitting journal articles and the peer review was described in pretty negative terms, and I can sort of attest to that. That it's slow and drawn out and painful. Those terms certainly apply to our experience. We had fairly decent reviews from reviewer number 1, who gave us some really concrete feedback and was like, yeah, you should consider some of these things, and then, resubmit. So that was okay. Reviewer number 2, which is, a cliche that was totally lived up to in our particular experience, had some pretty harsh truths for us after we submitted our article. Number 1 here being, unfortunately, I think you may have taken too big a bite. More comments from reviewer number 2. I do think there is a remote possibility that you could drastically rewrite this article. Very, very encouraging. To start with, what was it you were comparing? I'm not sure they read it all the way. That's what I have to say about that. So I would strongly recommend you include an art librarian. This was particularly painful for me. I have a master's in art history. I was an art librarian in my previous position. Ouch. I have a lot of sympathy for how difficult this turned out to be. I still think the concept is good and solidly researched. This would be a tremendous study. All right. So we could almost, what with the pattern that we have, take that last comment and be like, shoot, they want us to write this again, I could tell. So we have an opportunity. Do we rewrite the article? The editors contacted us. They said, you have some choices. We're open to you rewriting this and submitting it, or you can pull your article and maybe we'll talk to you later. So do we rewrite this article? I hand it up.
Yeah. Okay, so do we rewrite this article? Turn to page 93. Yeah, I guess so. Going back to the drawing comparisons board. Or page 66, we're completely over it. We've been over it. Maybe there's another path somewhere. So who would keep going? Who would rewrite the article in the face? Person in the back just shot it up. Reviewer number 2. Be damned. You're going to go for it. Yeah. So if anyone's keeping score, we've said yes, 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 and this time we decided to say no for a lot of reasons. So we decided against rewriting this article for this particular publication. First, we decided to reframe the article and the ideas. So that was kind of, we thought, we're going to come off our Charleston high, we're going to write this article, it didn't go so great, so now we're just going to take a break and kind of reframe our project and our ideas. What struck us most, and it won't be surprising because it's sort of the basis of this presentation, is that the process was equally interesting as sort of the data outcome and any kind of, quote, conclusions that we could draw. So how we worked together, how our systems worked together, and how our data worked together or didn't work together to sort of tell this story was just as compelling as what we were trying to get to initially in that aggregation of data and those pretty ambitious research questions that were comparing format preferences in the art and architecture subjects. So part of that reflection was also sort of regrouping so that we could mindfully come back to this and also do so with some care for our own well-being. And I'll just pause there because I don't think it's emphasized enough, but these are really big projects and we all wear multiple hats, right? I mean, hardly any of us have just one job. And here we were, we had just met and we were learning our jobs. And then in some cases, some of the skills we were learning in our jobs, we were just pivoting and then just applying them directly to this project. And so we were just on the road to burnout. And also we had so many sort of obstacles along the way, a lot of successes too. And so we really just needed to reflect a little bit more. But of course, for those sitting on the edge of your seats, and I know you all are, hoping that you'll be able to read an article authored by the four of us, never fear, because the collaborative librarianship publication is where we're sort of headed to next. And the article, the way that we framed it, was really in the process of a multi-institutional collaborative collection assessment project. So it has less to do with sort of the data outcome and much more to do with all of the steps it took, and I hope that we outline them clearly here, all the steps that it took for just us to get to the point where we could even do a data analysis. So we're almost at the final chapter, and so we'd like to humbly offer, and I really underscore that, some recommendations before you sort of embark on your own collaborative assessment project or are sort of you're at the end of it and you want to do kind of a post-mortem. And I say humbly because it's clear that we made some good decisions and many of you agreed with those decisions to move forward, and we made some not so great decisions and some of you said, like, don't do that. So the first question that we asked ourselves and also that we continually asked ourselves throughout this process was, why collaborate? But more specifically, it was, what is the added value that we hope to gain by including other institutions in our projects, right? So there are a lot of reasons to collaborate, and part of the reason we collaborated was because we wanted to keep working together. And so this project was kind of a diagnostic project to see if we could pursue research together in the future. It ended up like a way bigger thing than we originally intended, but that was sort of our reason to collaborate. Maybe you're part of a consortium and you think, okay, this is sort of a natural fit. Maybe you're geographically located, you're in the same time zone, your libraries are either very similar or very different. You could learn something from that. So one recommendation we have, and maybe it's sort of the biggest recommendation, is to really understand and be clear about why you are collaborating. If this was a project just about USC, I didn't really need my colleagues in these other institutions, but it was really for us about seeing these broader trends and responding to this article from Michael Evan Clark. The second recommendation is to always think about the scope of your research, but specifically related to scope creep. Is everyone familiar or is intimately familiar with scope creep? Okay, so and we say that because if you could, when Madeline presented, or maybe it was Jamie, our research questions and then sort of what resonated and kind of what lifted to the top, we started with scope creep, right? Like we started with this massive scope and then kind of got broader and then got narrower. And so scope creep, especially when you're thinking about your own capacity, is very real, and we recommend those sort of benchmarks along the way to make sure that you're not expanding too quickly or unnecessarily. The third recommendation is to think like a project manager. And for this, we sort of have a few ideas, but a good project manager, or at least in our experiences, they maintain sort of a status of deliverables. In 2 weeks, we're going to get this one thing, and in 2 weeks and 1 day, if we don't see that one thing, someone's going to come knocking, you're going to get a phone call, an email. We had to really think like that. We had to constantly think about our capacity and balance for this work, because we all had full-time jobs and we had personal lives, and so we were doing this sort of in the corners of our work, and sometimes it got to be a lot. So we had to think about maybe extending a deadline or not building out that research question as robustly as we would have wanted to. And then maybe most important, keeping clear notes and documentation. Good project managers, I think, always keep very clear notes and documentation, and it was very, very important to us, specifically around file naming conventions and the things that we talked about in the last conversation that we swore we wouldn't forget, and we knew what we were going to do, and then of course life got in the way. So so clear documentation was really helpful for us, and then clear kind of solid note taking that we could refer back to was incredibly helpful. And then finally, and I wrote this not to be particularly provocative, but to label people. And so what really helped us, and we didn't do it in the beginning, but maybe it'll help you, is we really had to determine the strengths and maybe weaknesses, but we're optimistic. We focused on the strengths of each team member. So what are we all bringing to the table? Are there things that we want to be learning from this collaborative project? Maybe skills that we want to hone that we're not getting in our daily work, or areas that we're kind of burnt out on I'd prefer someone else to do it. Ideally, you would have done this before, and you would sort of self-identify your strengths, and then beforehand you'd have a very handy conversation, and you'd sort of be able to map each other and figure out how this would all work together. I think we accidentally fell into a really great kind of group where our skills and our strengths really complemented one another, and then also the things we wanted to work on in our kind of our own work we could do through this project. So labeling people in real life, not so exciting, but in terms of collaborative projects, incredibly helpful. So now that we've taken you on this journey with us, and we'd offer some recommendations for our future projects, we wonder, what adventures do you have in store, and of course, what will you choose? So this is sort of the point at which we want to open it up a little bit and have more of a conversation. This is a lively lunch after all. So what you see on the screen right now are just sort of some suggested questions or just some ideas that we came up with to shape the conversation. But first, I thought maybe we should just kind of open it up, right? So in the beginning, some people said, yeah, I'm in the middle of a collection assessment project, or I've done one. Maybe we can start there. How's it going for you? How is that resonating? Are you interacting with different systems and technologies? Is it working? We can also go buy the book and answer the questions that are on the screen, too. How about we start there? Okay. So, how many of you have had experiences that were similar to those discussed in the presentation? Maria. Anyone else? Hi. So we would have preferred just a roving microphone, but that doesn't exist. So you can come up, or you can yell really loud.
I can project.
Excellent.
Sherry Michaels from Indiana University, and I'm the head of collection management. And so we are just embarking on a whole assessment project. And I want to know everything. And so it's really hard to focus on the one thing that you can accomplish right now. And so we're just in that process of trying to figure out what tools we have for which question we can answer. But a lot of the data is preventing us from doing anything because everything you do is based on records, and we're not so confident that the records are right. So we've actually stopped, and we're now doing an inventory of all 2.5 million volumes to clean up the records to get it to be right, so that we have confidence in the data when we actually try to run reports.
Right.
So we started that about 1.5 years ago, and it's slow going, but we're working through it. But that was really one of the big things for us, was having confidence in the data in the first place in order to be able to make your decisions.
Did you know that you weren't confident in the data pretty early on? It seems like that the answer is yes.
Yes, because we have offsite storage, and when we ran lists of things that should get moved to storage, when we went to pull the book, it wasn't there. Or we had 3 copies of the book. One has circulated 100 times, the other one has never circulated. It's not
Right.
real. And so we knew based from our moving things to offsite storage that there were some problems with the records themselves.
So now in order to even ask simple questions of the data, you're doing this full, so everything's sort of delayed until you can finish this inventory.
Yeah, we're moving on with some things that we're trying, but yeah, I'm just not convinced that it's worth doing if you don't trust what you have in front of you.
Absolutely. Just want to comment on that?
Yeah, I definitely resonate. One of the most frustrating things has been lack of confidence in the data, and because it sort of makes everything else feel like, is it worth it? It's sort of like in a perpetual existential crisis, like, is this real? Is this worth making any decisions based on it? And I have had multiple experiences of running the same report and having 2 different data outcomes from the same report. I've had vendors send me a report, and I'm like, wait, what is that? And they're like, oh, no, use this report instead. So, and that's been a real thing, and it makes it really hard to move forward with confidence. So it's very smart to me to invest in making sure your data is accurate as possible. It also means the fire swamp part of your process is like the longest part. So what I've learned from this is how much time and effort just making sure your data is legit and cleaning it appropriately without making mistakes and losing things and like misaligning your columns or something really easy in Excel can really make your data messed up. So that's the hardest part and the most important part in my opinion.
So did the, one of the problems we have is with electronic resources not having call numbers. And so trying to compare anything with an ebook is impossible. So did you get that from the vendors? Did they supply like a subject heading at least? Or how did you get your ebook information about, other than just guessing from the title?
We used eBook Central, and I believe if you use like a their usage report, it's not a counter report, but just their sort of their own system usage report. They've assigned call numbers to a lot of their books and subject headings. So we used that. We did VLOOKUP based on the counter report, and then crosswalked that to the usage report from eBook Central, or EBL as it was once called.
And I have done a fair amount of manual lookups for call numbers. So I use classify.oclc.org to manually enter ISBNs or titles, and it generates the most commonly assigned call number for a book title. So I use that all the time. I wish that you could batch upload things to that, which you cannot. But it's a beta thing. But that's like my best website friend for this kind of thing, even though it's very time consuming.
Hey, in the back.
I think one of the points that I'd like to make to a group is that I think a lot of us have experienced this, but a problem with even counter data not matching up is every vendor that you see or have dinner with, talk to them about what the data are that you need. Because what's really frustrating, streaming video people have decided to create their own subject headings. And they mean nothing outside of their actual own environment. And they're not the only ones. But we have a legitimate subject heading. We have legitimate call numbers. We as a profession are all about standards, and yet the vendors often just make up things. And it becomes very hard to compare things over time. And so you have to go in and create your own files, of course, which is great because you get control of them in that way. But then you have to create your own, like this is going to be our standard. We're going to go call number. And you have to look them all up. But if we step back a little bit and talk to vendors directly and say, these are the data that I need, as a group, we can really make an impact. So keep a list.
I think that's a great reminder, just sort of leveraging that vendor relationship. Have you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but does it work?
It can work. I think that we've been surprised when vendors say to us, call number. What do you want call number?
You're like, really?
Just run by call numbers and you have any idea. So I think that there's not any meanness on their part. It's just a total lack of comprehension that you need comparators across data.
Want to go out another question?
Yeah.
All right, let me try to throw another question out for us. So how many of you are interested in collaborating in a multi-institutional collection assessment? Or have you done one, maybe you stopped, maybe you've just completed one? Hey, in the back. Do you, yeah.
I did one at, when I was at the University of Illinois, but we had a shared ILS. We did it within our Carlin Consortium.
Oh.
And the shared ILS was critically important to that. But now I'm at Santa Clara University and we bought Green Glass. And so that is also a really interesting tool that is highly recommended. Because it does take a lot of, it takes MARC records basically.
Yeah.
So you're already starting with a lot of data that everybody's contributed at some shared level of understanding. The problem with the Carlin Consortium was people would recatalog things or not catalog them, and maybe ISBNs would match up or they wouldn't. You know, it's all about matching that data, and that's why those data points become so critical. So if OCLC or Green Glass is going to get in that business, which they are, and they're doing a great job, you know, go in with that, and then at least you've got shared data points across institutions, and almost everybody has MARC records and participates in OCLCs.
Anyone else? Maria?
I wanted to talk about some of the reasons why we all want to do that collaboration and get more data. We're so desperate for clear results and something to point us in the right direction that sometimes we tend to generalize from not sufficient data. So, for example, the study that I'm working on now and that I'm presenting here in Charleston, I really wanted more data. I'm looking at only 8,000 books. I really didn't think that was enough, but because of the migration from one system to another, because the previous system didn't have the data that I need for this study, I just had to, you know, I started with, I want to know everything for all the books, and obviously that cannot happen. So in order to be precise, you need to keep excluding these books. I can't get the data for those, and those don't fit some other criteria. So for this would have been fantastic if I could collaborate with somebody who had more data, so we could combine it, and I don't go generalizing from, you know, sample of data that, you know, I've read articles where somebody says, students like ebooks or students hate ebooks,
Right.
and then you read their methodology. They interviewed 6 students.
I know exactly what you mean.
You gotta know that how much data you start from and how much you can generalize from that. So the more the better. You know, we just instinctively know that, which is why we're going through this struggle. Problem is that, you know, not everything is comparable and not everything works that way.
Right. Do you guys want to ask any questions? Jamie?
So, I mean, are there any other projects that you guys have out there, or any other questions that are percolating around where you think that you see the value in multi-institutional assessment versus just trying to take what you have from your home institutions?
Well, I'm Dr. Loyola Marymount University participants in this. So I'll discuss briefly something that Erica from USF and Rice Majors from Santa Clara University are working on related to using ILL data through our in-reach or all in-reach institutions. We should be, in lots of ways, by any measure, we would be very comparable institutions, all about the same size, all in California, all Jesuit, and we are trying to compare our borrowing in our Link Plus, which is an innovative in-reach system, compare what we borrow, basically looking to see the things that we didn't purchase at our individual institutions and what we're buying from the other institutions. And things like normalizing data. I mean, you would, again, we're all in institutions. 2 institutions do not count our lending to other institutions as part of our usage statistic, but one doesn't, 2 do. So that immediately throws off. So we're counting things internally different, which is just a setting innovative that 2 of us chose to set one way and 1 chose to set the other way. And this issue of the fact that the data doesn't stay the same. So, for example, the Claremont Colleges used to be part of this consortium. They are no longer part. So 1.whatever million volumes came out of that collection. The Cal States were part of the collection. This last year, they all came out. So it's constant.
Right.
We can't even compare year to year. So definitely sympathize with that. But the collaborative process is really useful. We find interesting things. It's how we can generalize that to other places that becomes a lot more.
Hi, I'm John Toffenelli from Columbia University, and I came a little late, so if I missed this, pardon me. But I find it interesting that you were focusing on art and architecture, which I have found to be a problematic area for ebooks, because some ebooks deliberately omit illustrations and say these illustrations are omitted for copyright reasons, and I've heard many things from our art librarian about that. So just with that in mind, I'm wondering, did you do there's specific communities in each of your institutions that use art and architecture books, and did you survey them or gather information from them about their preferences for print versus ebook?
Go ahead.
I think what we were hoping to do just at the outset was see what we could learn just from data. And even for us, we were starting at at the basics, that we just wanted to even know if there were publishers publishing in both formats or not. And in many cases, no, like completely different publisher, or the publishers that were being used in print, they didn't even publish or make available those same books in e. And that we knew that getting more understanding about preference and behavior would be more of a qualitative pursuit that we weren't going to do at this level. But that if we wanted to dig more into art and architecture, we would need to do that. I think the sticky wicketness of art and architecture was one of the things that made it really appealing, especially because we have this assumption that's not necessarily based on anything except conversations with the art librarian, that art and architecture students don't like ebooks and that they don't use them. And so when Michael Levin Clark's study found that actually art and architecture ebooks were used quite a lot and very in depth, that surprise finding is what made us in part decide that this was something we wanted to look at, and just in terms of the quantitative data at first.
Anything else? Oh, yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about your results? I mean, even if you didn't publish them, did you feel like you got anything to say on
Yeah, I have all the data printed out on a piece of paper. But basically, one of the main things that we did was this leanings thing. So understanding what particular art and architecture subclass was used in what format more or less of the time. And let me quickly get to that page here. You can also download our poster. It's in Digital Commons, open access for more details on the actual findings. I should probably know this off the top of my head a little bit better. If I could see that, I would totally, yeah. I'm never going to be able to scan that fast enough to come up with an exciting thing to say about it. One of the things that I do remember was that art and architecture, in print, the most used books were on general topics, so they were more likely to be in N, visual arts, and then the ebooks were more likely to be on more specific topics.
Did your findings match those of Michael Levin Clark or not? You know?
He had, it was just one piece of data that art and architecture books were used in depth. We didn't
to other classes.
Compared to other classes, that's right. So we just sort of took it from there to do the print and e comparison that didn't exist in his original study.
Maybe we could just list the print and leanings. So Madeline mentioned leanings. So just for print leanings, and yeah, you should look at our poster. So for print leanings, the subject areas were architecture, decorative arts, painting, print media, and sculpture. And then the E format leaning subject areas were arts in general, so Madeline suggested like sort of general arts, and that's the NX, drawing, photography, and visual arts.
I remember not being surprised that print and printmaking was more popular in print.
In print, yeah.
I had a question for Glenn and Erica doing the ILL project. Was there a point where you just thought about abandoning the project because the data was just too problematic, or?
No, and you're not talking about. I was going to say 3:30 tomorrow. But no, because we were doing it not. We had a very practical outcome we wanted to do, which was we were trying to actually purchase books that were being borrowed. Our institutions were borrowing from other places, so we had specific. I mean, we were getting down to the title level, and I came into this after you. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have 3 pages of questions.
No, we wanted to spend money, so.
Right, yeah, so we started out looking at what we were borrowing and then trying to purchase those titles that were borrowed a lot, and then it has also sort of grown into, all right, so beyond individual title purchases, what subject areas do we now need to look at? And so I said, we're extremely similar institutions, but what's very interesting is the areas that my institution needs to beef up our collections in general, like let's say music. We don't even have a music program, and yet there's clearly a demand. We're borrowing a lot of those books. So we'll buy more of those, but yours, I pick something, some humanities, something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in some other subject area, it was kind of coming up in the data for you to collect. So we'll buy those books. We'll continue to borrow those from you. We can have our music books. That was kind of the idea, like to strengthen our own collections for our users and all that. So it's been a really interesting project. And then as each thing happens, right, like people drop out of Link Plus or other things happen at our institutions with our budgets, it's still valid data. And it's still just going to keep going until we get to a point where maybe it does balance out. I don't know. I don't expect that to happen.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. Do you have another question? Okay, so if there's no other comments? Okay, so I'm just going to start. I don't mean to get everyone dizzy. So here it is. So stay in touch with us, please. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll stick around if you have any other questions. So good luck in your collaborative collection assessment, and we'd love to hear how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you.